Do I really enjoy being a doctor in Switzerland? That's a question a UK friend of mine asked me the other day. She was also wondering if the Swiss medical training system is also harder than in the UK. We had a very long discussion about it, and I thought I'd share some of the points that we discussed, which hopefully will help you if you're thinking about moving to Switzerland to work as a doctor. Is the Swiss medical training system harder than in the UK? Now, just a small point about comparison. Now, we all say comparison is the thief of joy. And I struggled with this when I moved to Switzerland. There was a part of my brain that was comparing the live version of me in Switzerland with the theoretical version of me that had stayed in the NHS and gone through the traditional training pathway that I knew so well and was comfortable in. And I don't think that's a healthy thing. Once you've made a decision in life, you move on with it. And like I mentioned in my last video, you don't make the right decision, you make the decision right. So whatever you've chosen, you go with it and you make that work for you. But the comparison we're talking about right now is for you. If you're thinking of moving to Switzerland, but you're not quite decided yet, having a comparative view of both systems is actually crucial to make an informed decision. So that's what we're doing here today. This is not going to be comprehensive. These are just sort of brief overview points to give you a broad picture of the differences in the two systems. And to answer the question now, in terms of difficulty of training, I would say that it's really hard to answer. And honestly, depending on what you find the most difficult, you'll be able to determine from the points I mentioned which one would be more challenging for you. I think definitely for me, without having gone through the entire UK system, because my postgrad training I've done in Switzerland, but comparing with what I know of it and what my colleagues are going through, I would say Switzerland is harder for everything that comes with medicine. So getting used to a new system, in a new language, figuring out how the training pathways work and how to best get the jobs that you need. But I wouldn't be able to say that the medicine in itself is harder. I think really when we talk about which training system is more difficult, perhaps we're thinking about number of hours, which we'll talk about, giving us an idea of the intensity of the training, the amount of teaching we get versus service provision, the opportunities that we get with training, and the quality of life that you can get, which is absolutely key when you're in training for years and years. So without further ado, let's get started. I want to start with the positive points in Switzerland first. This might seem like a bit of a superficial point, but I think it really does matter, the environment in which you work in. I would say that's a plus for Switzerland. Overall, you can tell the healthcare system and infrastructure is more well off than in the UK. And that's something that sort of surprised me when I got there. All the residents got a smartphone on the first day, and that follows you throughout your training, and it's basically your on-call phone. So your personal number to be reached and to use on your nights. And it's just so nice to have an actual phone ringing where you can change the ringtone rather than having a beep that's just beeping in your ear. That's literally why we call it a beep, day and night. So that was a little thing that just makes everyday working in Switzerland more agreeable. Same thing for the actual infrastructure. So in the UK, on my first junior doctor job, I remember I started off in orthopedics and I was sharing a tiny office that had 3 computers with 7 or 8 F1s, including 5 SHOs. And I remember in the morning you had to get there first to use your computer, otherwise you'd have to go to the secretary desk, or if you were lucky, if your consultant let you use their computer, or you just grabbed one of the nurses' computers. And it was just an extra hurdle, making your already difficult job even more difficult. Same thing for the printers that were always breaking down. As doctors, we struggled in the UK because of just bad infrastructure. And when you spend an extra 15 to 20 minutes trying to find a printer that works or fixing it yourself, when you're already running behind on discharge letters and have so much to do, it definitely doesn't help. So 1 point for Switzerland for the infrastructure, which definitely makes life easier. The second point, which I kind of have to mention because that's what most people see as the big difference between the UK and Switzerland, and it's non-negligible, it's the pay. So if I compare my monthly salary back in the UK as a first year resident and in Switzerland as a first year resident, my pay was pretty much more than double. Now, bear in mind, the taxes you pay afterwards in Switzerland, whereas in the UK, it's already deduced from your paycheck. So there is that difference. But come on, more than half, that's definitely a big difference. And it plays a huge role in the quality of life that you can afford with that. I don't think I've actually made a video about the salary differences. So let me know in the comments down below if you'd like to know more about that. So that's another bonus for Switzerland. Number 3 in favour of Switzerland would be getting paid for your time. So in the UK, there was a system, I think it depends on your hospital, but there was a system to get reimbursed for your overtime. But it was a hassle to even ask. There was a form you needed to fill in. Multiple people needed to validate it. Whereas in Switzerland, we have a badge and we tap in and out morning and evening, which I'm not a huge fan of for other reasons, but the advantage is that if you work any overtime, then you will be reimbursed either financially or by extra days off. The fact that it's built into the system and you're sure that you're going to be reimbursed for that is definitely a huge advantage, which should be sort of a given in any country, but unfortunately is not. I know that in France, for example, you can forget about even requesting reimbursement for your overtime. There is no way they're even considering that. So that's a definite big plus for Switzerland. So we have 3 big pluses so far for Switzerland. A 4th big plus is that you can pretty much stay in the same region in Switzerland for for the whole of your training, which is saying a lot if you compare to the UK, where most of us and most of my colleagues now have to travel around the country, work in different hospitals, different regions, and it can be so challenging to have to move your life around, especially if you have a partner who also has a job somewhere, or even kids who are already settled in a school, every time you want the next job in your training pathway. So in Switzerland, already it's a smaller country, so even if you have to travel to a different canton, it's not that bad. I have a bunch of colleagues who work in one canton and live in another, and they still only have like a half-hour drive. Without going into too much detail, the way that the training program in Switzerland is built means that you have to work in certain big hospitals, like university hospitals ideally, or category A hospitals. A, because it's a certain size with a certain number of professors in each department and a certain number of patients. And you need to be able to work in one of these hospitals for a number of years, depending on what specialty you're doing. And then the rest of your training you can do in a peripheral DGH hospital. So a hospital that's usually smaller and easier to find a job in, but amazing for your training because you get to oftentimes do more things since there are less specialists in the hospital and you sort of get to manage more stuff on your own. And I can't tell you how great it is to be able to pick an area of Switzerland that you like, whether it be because your family and friends are there, whether the nature is stunning, and just stay there for the entirety of your training pathway and even settle there later as a doctor, either in hospital or in clinic. So in terms of quality of life so far, if we're looking at salaries, paid overtime, location, and the infrastructure, all of that makes the training in Switzerland more agreeable and therefore easier in that sense. The last pro-Switzerland point I'm going to mention here, and it depends on how you see it, but for me it's a pro, there's a lot less stuff around logbooks. I remember in my first year working in the UK, we would all stress about this logbook where we had to fill in practical skills that we had to get supervised and communication skills, and then you get extra points for teaching and conferences and academia, research papers, etc., etc. And those are great skills to learn if you're into that. But some people aren't interested in research, and whilst it is important to be able to read and analyse a research paper, a lot of people just want to do their medical degree, which is already quite hard and already a lot of work, and just get it done with. And in Switzerland, you get the choice to do that. So if you're interested in academia, there are specific pathways that really help you lean into that and help you publish and present at conferences, etc., etc. Otherwise, it's not a prerequisite that is demanded and compulsory for every year of your training. Now, it can be a bit of a bonus for interviews, for getting jobs, but even then, it doesn't matter as much as in the UK, which to some people who aren't that much into academia and more into medicine as a job, that is a big bonus. Even to validate your years of training, it's a lot easier. So let's say you work in a hospital for 2 years. At the end of that 2-year rotation, if you've been in the same department, you just have one meeting with your supervisor, get everything signed off, and you're good. And during the year, you do have some mini docs, so practical skills and communication skills that need to be supervised, but a lot less than in the UK. So that's definitely a big plus for me because there's already so much on our plate. It's really nice not to have to worry about this extra thing. It's getting dark. Let's finish off this video. Here are some of the negatives of Switzerland, which makes the training more difficult and which you can see as the pros of the UK training system. Number one, in no particular order, are the working hours. So although you're reimbursed for your overtime, you have to work more base hours in the week. So in Switzerland, it's 50 hours a week. So it's 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. all days of the week, or if you're doing night shifts or weekends, it kind of balances out. 50 hours is the baseline, which is quite a lot of time, especially considering that most of us are going to do overtime anyways. If you compare that to the UK, depending on what training you're in or which specialty, what year you're in, we could say it's roughly between 46 to 48 hours. That's without overtime, but let's assume we have to do overtime everywhere. Those extra couple of hours do actually make a difference. And once you finish your long day at 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. sometimes, you don't have that much time left to enjoy Swiss nature. So that could be a bit of a slippery slope. And in a way, it pushes you to really work hard during those hours of the day and then enjoy your evening. But I definitely felt those extra hours of work when I moved here. So bear that in mind if you're thinking of moving to Switzerland. Another challenge in Switzerland is the Swiss training program. Now, this can be a video in itself, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but there are things in there that could be seen as an advantage for you and an ease or a difficulty. But essentially, the training system in Switzerland is very much à la carte, which means that there are some basic criteria that you need to adhere to and fulfill to get your degree recognized, but the rest of it, you have quite a lot of flexibility in terms of the jobs that you take, in which specialties, and in which hospitals. So for example, internal medicine, it's 5 years in Switzerland, and that allows you at the end to work as an internal medicine hospitalist. So you work in the hospital as a generalist, or you can work as a GP doctor in a clinic. So duration for internal medicine is pretty much the same because in the UK, there's 2 years of junior doctor and then 3 years of GP, whereas in Switzerland, it's 5 years of internal medicine. That brings us to our first point. So the advantage is that you go straight into the specialty that you're interested in theory. So internal medicine, that's the case. Let's say you want to be a cardiologist, you'll do 5 years of internal medicine. In those 5 years, you can get a year or two of cardiology training, and then afterwards you'll do an extra roughly 3 years of cardiology. And I'm simplifying here. There are some years of your internal medicine training that you can get counted as your cardiology training, but you need to do that sort of general internal medicine hospitalist training first. If you want to become a pediatrician, for example, in theory, you can start straight away in peds training. That would be a big advantage if you compare to some other countries where you have to do some general sort of medicine training before you can get into your specialty. However, in Switzerland, it can be hard to get that first training post. And I'm going to talk a bit about that later on. In theory, it looks great. Getting your first job can be really tricky, and it really depends on the networks that you have and how early you've applied. That's the main thing. So I put that more as a downside because considering from what I've seen, so this is sort of informal survey style data, it's pretty difficult to get straight into the training that you want without having to do a year or two of some other medical specialty before that. But going back to the example of internal medicine, for the 5 years of your training, you have to do 3 years in internal medicine. And then 2 of the years, you can do whatever you want. It can be psychiatry, it can be internal medicine, it can be another specialty you're interested in. And that's really great because it gives you flexibility. However, I would count that as a negative point as well, because it's really stressful to plan out your years of medical training on top of the work that you're already doing, which takes up at least 50 hours, if not more, generally more, of your week. In the UK, once you've got your specialty training pathway, you've done the interview, done the exam, you're in. You know what you're doing, you're confident in the training system, and you know what you're getting. There aren't any surprises along the way. Well, there's always surprises, but at least you know what your training is going to entail. In Switzerland, because you're doing it à la carte and you have that flexibility, every 6 months or year, you have to find your next job. So you can do that well in advance and have, your 5 years planned out. That definitely works. And that's pretty much what I've been able to do as well. But a bunch of my colleagues don't have a job in 6 months' time or a year because they're just not taking the time to apply, go to interviews, etc., etc. So there is an extra layer of added stress to plan out every step of your training pathway in Switzerland. The reason why I say it's not necessarily a good or bad thing, for me, it was more of a downside than an upside because it just added all that extra work to already a new system that I wasn't used to. So time-wise and stress-wise, not great. But if you've discovered these videos and you already have a lot more information than I did starting in Switzerland, this could be a really positive point for you because it really gives you the flexibility to pick exactly what you want to do in your training. And as long as you know how to do it and you do it well in advance, you should be fine and you should be able to thrive in the system. Another challenge in Switzerland is how competitive it can be. Now, not necessarily because the standards are much higher or that the applicants that you're competing with are better. It's just that the country is smaller. So like I mentioned extensively in other videos, you do need to speak one of the main languages, which is French, Italian, or German, or Romansh, but we don't really count that one because it's such a small area of the country. So just probability-wise, if you speak German, you've got a better chance of getting a job because there are more jobs for German-speaking doctors. If you speak French, it's a much smaller percentage of the country. So that just makes it more competitive, and depending on what specialty you want to get into, that can make your training harder. Harder in the sense that it takes longer to get the job that you want, and harder also because you're doing medicine, which is already hard, in another language if you're not a native speaker. And whilst it's an amazing experience and it teaches you so much and helps you develop so many skills outside of medicine, we're talking strictly about medical training here. So in that sense, it is a challenge and therefore a point for the UK rather than Switzerland. The last thing I'm going to mention in this comparison of the two training pathways is just how much networking matters in Switzerland. This can be a great advantage for you, but for all the rest of us, it's more of a downer. Okay, this is subjective. It's based on my personal experience and discussions I've had with colleagues in multiple different cantons. But I think partly because Switzerland is still a small country, networking plays a big role in the jobs that you can get. I'm not necessarily talking about nepotism, but a lot of medical jobs are gotten via word of mouth. So if you work in a certain hospital, you get along with everyone, you build rapport with your colleagues, and then that colleague gets a job in another hospital, and all of a sudden there's a position, they're looking for a doctor, you're more likely to get that job via a referral versus a colleague who's just as qualified as you, who's cold applying to that hospital. Now, this is reality. It happens everywhere, and a big part of it is just human connection. If you get along well with someone, you can work with them, you're more likely to give them the job because the other person is sort of an unknown variable. And I've definitely seen how much that matters. Now, again, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that if that's a strong point for you, good on you. And if it's not, then you might have to work extra hard to build those connections and network to get the best training pathway for you. So after that long discussion with my friend, we haven't actually reached a solid conclusion. She's sort of undecided. I've slowly transitioned into being pro Switzerland, but it did take me a while, and I can definitely see the upsides of the UK training system. And I think there's a lot that can be done to improve the Swiss training system. Is it harder? For the reasons I mentioned in this video, I would say yes, just because of all the skills around medicine and all the challenges around medicine that you need to go through and deal with, but with the quality of life that you can get, I think it's worth it. So which training system do you think is harder, Swiss or UK, and which would you prefer? Let me know in the comments down below, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.